Welcome back to Refactoring Paleo Rose. My name is Thomas Moore, and we are working on updating build settings for the project. A technical note, it's really cold outside, and my heat is going on like crazy, so you might hear some noise in the background. It's just the heat. So we talked before about the different build settings in Xcode that we may need for our app. And we have a lot. And some we need, some we probably don't need anymore. At the very bottom, we can see a whole bunch of user-defined settings, and likely that these are not required for the current state of the app. Now, we'll go ahead and get rid of some of these, but first things first. I don't like how our app configurations are set up, so let's go there first. If we remember, we have these three different settings. In a modern app, when you have set up with Xcode directly, you have a debug version and a release version. In our scheme, the equivalent is development and deployment. And I really don't know what the default is for anymore. So we're going to take a risk and we're going to rename these. Okay, so now we're in a more modern configuration. We'll set our default to be release, and we will do a build real quick. Okay, successful build. Let's take a look at the schemes really quickly to make sure everything is set up correctly. So the scheme should be in run mode, should be debug, test mode should be debug, profiling should be release, analyze, debug, and archive, release. So the reason why we have this distinction is some of these have different configurations have different settings that are more conducive for debugging and more conducive to release. So for example, release has different optimization settings. It will have different settings for debugging. So we want those two distinct. So now we have this more modern setup. So why don't I go ahead and make a commit. Okay, let's go back to settings. So one of the things we want to look at are what are the differences between the build settings for our app and the build settings for the test app. There are a lot of differences, but a lot of them really don't make any sense. Let's start by just removing what we definitely do not need down here. ZeroLink, which is a tool that is no longer in Xcode. So we don't need that. Xcode docs, we may need that, or excuse me, Xrose docs, we may need that. We'll have to investigate that later when we work with the help book, if we choose to keep the help book. Swift version, Swift optimization level, Objective-C bridging header, and even this I'll come back to that one in a minute. But these three categories are for Swift code, which we don't have yet. So we'll get rid of those for now. This flag is for optimization, and I don't think this particular flag is what's currently being used. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. We can always add them back. Debugging symbols have also changed quite a bit since this project was originally created, and so this flag is no longer of use. Okay, let's do a quick build. And let's go ahead and do some testing. Great. So we're in good shape. As I mentioned, there's a lot of differences between this app and the test app. One setting we may want to look at that I found, do the search filter, is this missing localizability. Excuse me. I think this is a really useful tool. This is something I think I've had set up only in my project, and I don't think it was in the test app. But I want it to be resolved as yes for at least the test build. I don't necessarily want it in the release build. It's only set for, it's set for both. So I want to turn this off for release. Why? Because I'm not going to be doing that much in release, but I do want to know while I'm building the app and testing the app if there's missing localization. Another thing that I think I have turned on in the app is dead code stripping. In this case, it makes more sense to me to have dead code stripping in the release version than in the debug. So I'm going to turn it off in debug. Another thing I have set up is enable trigraphs. So I have that set to be no in both. So trigraphs are usually when you have operators with 3 symbols instead of 2. Right now, I don't know if it's even being set in the test app. Let's take a look at the test app. And that's set to no. And we want to have that consistent. So I'm fine with that being no. But it looks like I'm specifically setting it, but I think the default is no. Okay. So we'll just go with the default. We don't want to set that ourselves. Next, we have debugging symbols. Now, by default, it's automatically turned on. I'm not sure what we want for release, because right now we have that turned off. We may come back to this one a little bit. Missing prototypes, we have that by default now, so we can actually clear this, and it'll be the default value. We don't need to have it specifically set. I also have a warning here that I found. By default, it is no, and that's what we have set, so we can probably get rid of it as a default. So it will now just go with the default value. Here's another one. Unknown pragmas. Default is no. We have it set to no. Let's get rid of it. There's nothing there and it's empty. Let's get rid of that one. So by definition, this one has a wrapper extension of app. Let's look at test and see if it uses that. So it resolves to app automatically. So we may not need to set this anymore. And that's what it does. So we don't have to set it ourselves. Now there are a number of things that are set in the test app that aren't set in our current app. So let's take a look at some of those values. So that's marked as deprecated, so let's go ahead and delete that one. Well, let's look at the test app first. So the test app is marked as no, and we're marked as no. So maybe we should just be consistent and have that there. Okay, by default, that is set to true. Let's see what it's set to in the test app. Okay, so this is a little bit different. By default, it is yes, but here it's yes aggressive. So I think that's a reasonable setting. Let's set it to aggressive. And let's go ahead and build. Let's look at the next one, C++ language. Compiler default should be fine. Let's see what we did in the test app. Now it specifies it to a particular new version. So I'm not going to worry about that one. As far as I know, we don't have any C++ code, so it might be important, it might not. Playing enable Objective-C weak. That is by default. No, that seems a little off to me. Let's see what we got over here. And by default, that is true. I'd rather have that being true. Correct use of ISA. By default is yes. In the test app, yes, but it produces an error. So that's an extra level of security. So let's go ahead and go with that as well. Since that changes that a bit, let's build. Documentation comments. By default, that's no. In the test app, that is set to true. So what this does, we'll make some warnings. So let's go ahead and add that. We have a warn for Objective-C root class, which by default is true. And in the test, what does it do? Produces an error. Let's go with that. Again, let's build. Unguarded availability by default is true. I suspect that's going to be an aggressive one in here. We'll make that equivalent. All right, debug information format. Notice we don't have anything set here. So here we have two different levels. So debug is dwarf and releases debug with dsym. And that's probably the right choice. So all right, let's build. Okay, what about hard runtime? And by default, here's no. What do we have in test? That is yes. For user script sandboxing, default is no. What do we have over here? Yes. Let's look at something real quick. Whoops. See language standard. Again, compiler default. I think I'll just leave it at that. Now this one's a little bit different. This one is to generate the plist file. And I assume that means it's pulling data out of here to generate the property or the plist. I should say the info plist. In this file, it is set to yes. So it's going to generate based on what is in here. I'm not sure if I'm ready for that transition, so I'm going to leave that as no. So the next one is localization prefers string catalogs. This is an Xcode 15 thing. We don't have any string catalogs yet, so I'm not going to change this one. In the test app, it probably is set to be true. Yes, and in fact, if you look in the test file, there's probably a string catalog somewhere. But maybe not. But it prefers it over the old style. We'll make that transition when we start using string catalogs. Here's one for emitting localized string, Swift UI support. We don't have any Swift UI yet, so I don't think we need to set this one, and by default it's set to true. So I think we've done enough for this for right now. There are a few settings that I may want to change in the future, but for right now, I think we've hit most of the high points of the changes. There are a lot more. I should point out another alternative to actually going through and making these changes is just to create a new app using Xcode. Doing so that way would give you all the default values. You can just bring all of your files over, and then you can just move on, and you would inherit all the fancy new stuff. I've done that many times before in other projects, but in this case, I just want to go through and just see what's changed and touch on some of the highlights. We're getting to the point where we're getting close to actually touching the code. We're going to have to do a few more things before we do that, and we're going to do that in the next episode or two, and then we can start changing code. I'm looking forward to that, so I hope you are too. Come back again, and my name is Thomas Moore, and this is Refactoring Paley Rose.